You're listening to the Family Podcast from PursueGOD.org.
Parents, I'm excited to share and highlight some things about a new series that we're going to be posting on PursueGOD.org, and it's called A Parent's Guide for the Teen Years. I've just had so many conversations with people recently that are just, dealing with some of the issues that come along with the teen years, thinking about disrespect and how do you not get triggered by your teenager that thinks you're so stupid? How do you deal with the irresponsibility that sometimes comes in the teen years of forgetting things and losing things? And then also the dating question. And I just remember these were issues for me when I was actively parenting with my own kids. And I'll tell you, in some things I did better than others, and I'll share that, some of my experiences. But what I'm going to do in this podcast is kind of highlight the 3 articles that are going to make up this series and just spend a few minutes highlighting what I think are some good insights from each of these 3 topics that hopefully could be helpful to you, for you and your husband to listen to. Maybe you guys are in a small group and you've got lots of families with teenagers, or you have a mentor in your life or just some good friends that you're like, oh my gosh, we're all in the same season of life. We're all struggling with the same kind of things. This series could be really helpful for you just to give you some framing principles and some strategies that can help you to really not just survive the teenage years, but really thrive and help your kids and your teenagers to grow, to be respectful, to be responsible, and to make wise choices when it comes to things like dating. So to get started, I'm going to start with the disrespect. And I know this was probably the most triggering thing for me, especially with my son, because he was like a debater. He would have made a great lawyer. He did not end up pursuing that in his life, but he always had a comeback line. He always had a question for whatever rule we were putting in place. And I just remember losing the battle so many times because I would let his flippant response or his tone of voice that felt sometimes condescending or just disrespectful that drove me crazy. And it was very triggering to me versus my husband would just not react to that. And I think there's probably a little bit of a difference of a son to his dad versus a son to his mom. And if I'm honest, I let my kids get away with some things more than maybe my husband did, but their dynamic was very different. My husband did not seem to react the same way that I did. So really, this topic for me is something if I wish I had had this when I was raising my kids, because I did not do super well in this. I would have reactions to disrespect. Because again, I think for me as a mom and as a woman, there's already a little bit of that sensitivity. Like if you've ever felt like people don't take you seriously, maybe in the workplace or maybe in your educational pursuits. And so you certainly don't want your kids to treat you that way. So there might be just a strong reaction in you like there was in me. What are some helpful things? How do we respond to our disrespectful teens? Well, the first thing that this article talks about is just the power of listening over lecturing. I know for a lot of parents, we talk about this in lots of our topics on Pursue God, just that lecturing and just talking at our kids is actually not helpful, especially when they become teenagers. Because, we talk about this idea of this principle that we're raising our kids and we're giving them more independence as they go, teaching them, mentoring them along. So but by the time they leave our house, they have the skills and the insights to be a fruitful, responsible, independent adult. So if all we do is lecture them, if all we do is just put rules in place and we just stick to these rules and we never really hear their heart, then we're kind of missing an opportunity to really build relationship and trust with our teenager. Because probably what happens, this is what would happen in our house too, is if I just had a hard and fast rule, what do our teenagers want to do? They want to challenge it. They want to question it. So a lot of the building of the relationship and avoiding some of the disrespectful behavior is to make sure as a parent that we speak with kindness and respect to our kids, right? That we treat them the way we want to be treated, but that we give them an opportunity to share their perspective. We may not agree with it, and we may have some reasons why we're very clearly not going to let them do X, Y, or Z, but giving them space to express themselves and that you can show the ability to listen can go a long way for your teenager to move past just having contempt for you because you're just standing in their way of the fun things they want to do. And they can start to see like, okay, mom and dad care about me. Their rules make sense. There's reasons behind them. They're not just, being like a jail warden, just trying to take all the fun out of life. So really getting to this place where you can listen to their perspective and not just lecture at them is very important. And again, like I started with saying, the more you can not react to the disrespect the moment it happens, the better off you're going to be as far as the trend line, so to speak, of your relationship. I mean, Proverbs 15, 1 and 2 gives a pretty profound picture. I want to read this to you. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Isn't that true? Like if my kids were disrespectful to me and I'm disrespectful back, now voices are raised and we're off to the races, and not a good way. But here's what it goes on to say. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge appealing, but the mouth of a fool belches out foolishness. Oh my gosh, to me that picture is like so vivid. That our kids need to understand that we are wiser. We've been around the block longer than they have. So when they can trust that our attitude towards them, our attitude towards raising them is about their good, about wanting to show love and care and want to hear their voice and hear their perspective, and then we can respond with why that can or cannot work, like that's appealing. That's going to be appealing to your teenager. If all we're doing is just responding in anger and maybe in condescension ourselves, it's like a belch, like gross. Does anyone like to be around someone that burps in your face or in your area? It's disgusting. So that might be a good mental picture as parents to recognize that when we just become reactive, we're not helpful to the circumstances and we're not gaining the trust and the respect of our teenagers. And then that can just send you in that death spiral where it just gets worse and worse. So that's something that I needed to hear, that there were times where what would have been better for me is just to say, you know what? I don't like the tone of voice that you're using with me right now. So I am happy to have this conversation, but not in this way. So why don't you go cool off for a few minutes, and when you can come back and have a tone of respect and that we can have a conversation, I'm good to go, right? That's something about setting boundaries. You know, that there were things like with my kids that if they were disrespectful and I said, if you speak to me that way again, there's going to be a consequence, and they did, you know, you're taking their phone. They're not going out that night, you know, whatever it is, that we have to be consistent and we have to set the boundary and the expectations of how our teenagers can speak to us. But we just have to remember that we also have to do our part as parents to not engage in that immature behavior by throwing it back at them. We have to be clear about, you know, what's the appropriate expectation of how we speak to each other and train our teens. And especially, honestly, guys, we really should be training our kids from when they're young. Like this isn't something that you just start doing when they're 15. You should be training your kids towards this and them understanding that using their words for good and for building up is what matters, that we speak with respect, that we're obedient, right? We're training our kids from a young age. So by the time we get to the teenage years, we've established these expectations. We've established some trust there in the relationship that then when the harder topics come along in the teenage years, you have a foundation to your relationship that then just doesn't become, you're just always saying no, you're not giving reasons why, you don't listen to your teenager, and then they just end up resenting you. Now, here's an important principle that we talk about, again, in a lot of our topics on Pursue God, but from Ephesians 6, 1 through 4, it says, "Children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord, for this is the right thing to do. Honor your mom and dad. This is the first commandment with a promise. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you, and you will have a long life on the earth." But it goes on to say, "Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up in the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord." So again, parents, I know this can be hard when the onus is more on us. Like we have to be the bigger person, but we're the adults. Like we are dealing with children who are teenagers. And yes, they are becoming wiser and smarter. And yes, they're working towards independence, but they still need mom and dad to say, hey, obedience is important. Because you know what? As you're training your kids to be obedient to you, ultimately, then when they leave your home, they have that heart of obedience that then goes to their relationship with the Lord. So what you're establishing is kind of like go between of your kids understanding that your rules, the things that you set up in your home, that they're for their good and for their protection, that then when they leave your home, they're not looking at then God saying, oh, you're not a good father. Your rules are just about taking the fun out of things. We just train our kids from a young age that obedience is good. First to mom and dad, but then ultimately to the Lord, because our role as parents is our mandate comes from God. So we need to reflect God's authority, his protection, his love, his boundaries to our kids. And so when we have a purpose in our parenting that way, and we understand our job is to bring them up in the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord, then when they're in these teenage years, they're trusting that our heart is for them. And that when we have to say no, we're saying no because we might just have a little bit more wisdom behind that rule or that boundary that they don't understand yet. So I want to end, because I thought this was really good at the end of this article, talking about not getting the tunnel vision. Because I think a lot of times as parents, we get so frustrated with our teenagers and they're disrespectful and they're not listening. And we just kind of get tunnel vision and focus in on that negativity, that disrespect. And then we just kind of treat them with disdain. We're just triggered as soon as we see them. They don't even have to have a word come out of their mouth. And I think as parents, again, we need to remember, like, they're kids. We're shaping them. They're learning. They're learning how to use their voice. They're learning what independence looks like. They're learning consequences for behaviors. So I think when we are dealing with disrespectful teenagers, find ways to interact with your teen that's positive. Whether you go do a hobby together, or you go shopping, or you play a sport, that you do things to remind you, like, this is your child, that little toddler that you loved and that adored you and just wanted to be hugged and snuggled all the time. This is just a kid trying to figure out their way. They need mom and dad still. So don't get the tunnel vision of just focusing on that negative behavior and then just treating them with, disdain or just with impatience. Like, look and encourage them, like, find ways to talk about, like, what do you see for your future? And here's all the talents that you have and things that I love about you, that speaks life into your relationship. So you don't just get stuck in the rut of just dealing with that disrespectful behavior. Okay. So that article is there on Pursue God, and we'll have this podcast at the top. But the next topic in the series is about the irresponsible teens and how do we deal with that? And this one I relate to because I was an irresponsible teenager. Early teens, like junior high. I remember this was sixth grade, I think. We still talk about this to this day. Like, I was in science class of some kind, and we had to do this leaf project where you had to go find all these different leaves from different trees, and you had to present them in like a creative way. And I forgot. And so I came home, I think the night before, and I was like, I have to have this whole leaf project done, and I haven't done any of it. And I remember my grandma was visiting, and my mom and my grandma went out and did the whole project for me because I didn't have time, and put it all together. Now, my mom definitely said, this is the last time I'm going to do that for you. But my mom completely and totally rescued me from the irresponsibility that I had. So there's, two ways to look at that. Sometimes is it good to, help your kid along and to be gracious? Yes. But I think there's a lot of times where we end up protecting our kids from the natural consequence. Like, you knew this was an assignment you had. Every day you should be looking at your planner or, your calendar and looking at what's due. So when we rescue them from those mistakes, are we really training and helping them towards responsibility? I also remember many times, like, I ran track and I would leave my jewelry. I remember distinctly one time leaving my necklace and the special ring my parents had bought me, and I left it in the grass or something of track practice. I don't know. These are two things that come to mind that my mom was so frustrated with me. I just was irresponsible. I just was kind of just winging it. I don't know what I was doing. So maybe you have one of those teenagers. Now, thankfully, over time, my parents worked with me. I did have an older sister that was responsible, and so she was a good influence on me. But I feel like by mid-high school, I had figured that out. I had realized I got to pay attention to things. So for those that are dealing with maybe the junior high age teen, they're driving you crazy with their irresponsibility. If you keep training them and teaching them and reminding them and set them up for success, many of them, I think, will end up finding those responsible responses to things like, I'm a hopeful story because I've gone on to be a pretty responsible person. I live by checklists. That helps me, which is one of the suggestions that we give you in this series is if you've got that irresponsible teenager, set them up for success by teaching them. For a lot of our teenagers, they've got just a million things swirling around in their mind. They've got the hormones going. If you're in sports, you've got friend drama. So, for some of it is they just have a lot going on and they're still learning some of these skills. So how can you set them up for success? And how can you keep their irresponsible actions from being a constant source of conflict in your relationship? Well, one of the things is teach them how to use checklists. Sit down on Sunday night before the week starts. What do we have going on? What are the homework assignments that are due? When do you have a test? Is there a paper you need to be writing? What do we have with sports? What are the things that we need to get planned for? And then additionally, maybe every night before they go to bed to be okay, you've got practice tomorrow. What, sports equipment do you need to be bringing? That bag needs to be packed and ready to go, right? Setting our kids up and training them, teaching them what responsibility looks like rather than just being how can you not figure this out? Because again, they're in kind of a season of turmoil, and some kids are just wired more to just be kind of all over the place, and other kids, they have no problem in this area. So that would be one thing I would say, teach your kids kids, well, and especially if you aren't particularly organized yourself, this is a good task for you as well. Like, this is a good thing to start like your week looking at everyone's schedules and planning accordingly. There's this idea of the Premack's principle. This was a psychologist, David Premack, that came up with this idea that can encourage better habits. And the idea is that the preferred behaviors can be used to reinforce the unpreferred behaviors. So, for example, your kids come home from school, part of the way you teach them responsibility is they do the less desirable thing first, homework, let's say, or a chore. And then once they complete that, they can do the more desirable task, which would be, playing the video game or hanging out with friends, right? So the Premack principle is use the preferred behavior to get them to first do the unpreferred behaviors and kind of teach them that, these are responsibilities that we have. We have to get our chores done. We got to get our homework done. And so once you get those things done that I know aren't as fun for you, then you can have the reward of the more preferred behavior. And then, of course, parents, I just think to just be reminded that the grace that God gives us in our failures and our missteps, to just be that way with our teenagers, that we choose patience. I mean, not that we don't help them along, not that we don't set them up for success. One of the things that could be a useful tool too is if, let's say, they missed an assignment and they call you and they're in a panic and you say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to get that to you today and you're going to have to suffer the bad grade. Your way of like the natural consequence would hopefully teach them that post that event that you could sit down and be like, okay, what happened here? How did we miss that? Right? Like showing grace, showing patience, showing the ability to be teachable with your teenager. So you're not just demanding some character trait to come out of them that you're not leading them toward. That's just part of our job as parents. And I know that can be so frustrating. I know my mom was so frustrated with me so many times, but she kept working at it with me, and she kept giving me, structures and ideas of ways to fix it for the next time, that eventually I figured that out and I didn't need so much of her babysitting in that area. So that would be just my encouragement to you when you're dealing with the irresponsible teenager, that you just have a balanced approach where you have firm boundaries, like you're not just rescuing them all the time, but you're also giving them useful tools like checklists and helping them to build those habits that will help them to be more responsible. And then the last topic in this series is about the dating piece. And I know this one can get super complicated super fast. And honestly, with our kids, we didn't have like that hard and fast age. Like we wouldn't even talk about dating until you're 16 or whatever. But a lot of parents do. So I'm not going to say that you shouldn't do that. But what I would speak to and what we speak to in this series is that the more important thing with your teenager to talk about with dating is really the principles behind how they should view it, and that you don't just go along with what everyone else is doing, that you're really thoughtful before you would consider dating someone. So, for example, one of the first things that I think is important, and again, this should be established long before the teenagers, is just reminding your teenager that they are precious creations of the Lord. Psalm 139 says that, I knit you together, all your delicate parts, and I saw you being developed in your mother's womb, and all of your days were marked and recorded in the book. Like God created your teenager with specific skills and abilities and a plan for their life. So first and foremost, from a young age, we should be telling our teenagers, like, you are a special creation of the Lord. Your identity needs to be in Christ, and let Him decide what's right for you, because He has a plan for your life. So when we get distracted by some of these relational things and get involved in relationships that we're not ready for, it just does damage, and it starts to eat away at what our value is and what our identity should be in. So first and foremost, it's just establishing who they are as a special creation of the Lord, because a lot of times our teenagers find that identity and that self-worth through the way people treat them, right? And so when you're talking about a dating relationship, now if you've got a jerk of a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they're just starting to hammer away at their self-esteem, like, we just want to start early saying, guys, like, we're going to be choosy and we're not going to be in a hurry to date. There's plenty of time for that. We need to start with your precious possession of the Lord, and nobody gets to tell you that you're not worthwhile, or nobody gets to make you feel like you're stupid or unattractive or whatever it might be. And then to layer on top of that is the understanding of the gift of purity. This is something that I think culturally we are just completely missing. And social media has done a doozy on this issue, and the pornography issue, which we talk about this in a lot of our resources on Pursue God. But to talk to your teenager about the principles that we find in 1 Corinthians 6, starting in verse 15, don't you realize that your bodies are actually part of Christ? Should a man take his body, which is part of Christ, and join it to a prostitute? Never. And don't you realize that if a man joins himself to a prostitute, prostitute. He becomes one body with her, right? That oneness principle we hear in Genesis 2. For the scripture says the two are united into one, but the person who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. And then it goes on to say, run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. Don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself. God bought you with a high price, so you must honor God with your body. I mean, think about that, parents. If we could frame that for our kids, again, starting even before the idea of dating happens, that they are precious, that their purity, their sexual purity matters, that you wouldn't take your body and think of it as like God's temple, right? That the Holy Spirit lives in us when we put our faith in Jesus, then we would join it to just a million sexual partners. Or in this case, he's talking about a prostitute. Like, of course not. You wouldn't treat your body that way if that's how you viewed yourself. But that's who we are. We're ambassadors for Christ. We want our teenagers to understand, like, if they've trusted Jesus for salvation, Jesus bought them. He went to the cross and paid the debt of their sin that they owed. So don't they want to look then at how they treat their body, how they interface with other people, how they think about sexual purity and future marriage, that they see that from God's point of view who designed it all, rather than letting the world to say, like, no, just go with whatever feels good, give away whatever you want to give to whomever you want to give it to. There's so many consequences that come from that. And maybe you as the parent have experienced that yourself. You know, some parents say, do you like share about your sexual history with your kids? I think that's an individual decision. I think that's a prayerful decision that you ask the Holy Spirit to lead you in that. But I think there's definitely a way that if you have had a history with making some decisions that you now regret as an adult or as a married person, that you could say to your kids, like, just trust me. You don't have to be specific, but just, if I could go back and do some things over, I would, because I paid some consequences. When we give ourselves away to people, when we're not mindful of the choices we're making in dating relationships, especially sexually, they don't realize in the moment the consequences that come from that. And those emotional attachments that form that they're not really ready for. They're not ready for it emotionally, and they're definitely not ready for it sexually, and you can't get it back. Like, once you give stuff away, you can't get it back. So to talk to your kids about the gift of purity, that even though people around them are going to be like, you're missing out, and, you know, so-and-so's not going to date you if you don't, you know, give them what they want, whatever that is, to say, no, my higher call is a follower of Jesus, my body, my attitude, my heart belongs to Jesus, so I'm going to go his way. Man, what a difference that can make if our teenagers go into those years, into the dating season with that kind of perspective, because then it gives them the confidence to say, okay, I'm not going to just choose to date anyone. I'm going to have some standards. And so, you know, for some people, they do meet a great person in high school and they're able to navigate that in a responsible way and hopefully have, you know, mentors and people around them that help them draw appropriate boundaries. That certainly is possible. But in most cases, who you are attracted to or who you want to date in high school is not in any way, shape, or form the person that you would want to marry. And I just think it's important to talk to our kids about that. You know, even to talk about your own dating history of like, gosh, I remember so-and-so when I was in sophomore year of high school, I just thought he was the bomb or whatever. And, you know, now I look back on that, I'm like, oh my gosh. And maybe like the life choices they made or where they ended up in life, you're like, oh my gosh, God totally protected me from that person. Because they didn't have good character traits. They didn't have good character traits then. So then what's the likelihood that they would have been a good husband or a good wife? And so I think talking to your teenagers, being honest about your own experiences to what's appropriate, setting them up to have a vision and a picture that as a child of God, as a precious creation, that Jesus paid a high price for, that they don't have to just go by the way of the world. In fact, the way of the world is going to bring heartache and pain and loss and confusion. And it's better to just say, I'm going to choose to be picky, I'm going to choose to be patient, and I'm not going to just rush into dating. And again, parents, I think the more you can speak to the principles behind it, the better it is than just saying you're not allowed to date till you're 16. And then all of a sudden they turn 16 and you've had no conversations, you've set no picture for that, no expectation for it. And then you're just like, good luck. And I think that's what a lot of parents end up doing. Like, you'll figure it out. Well, we need to train them for that. We need to prepare them for what a future dating relationship could look like. And it would be better to frame it from a biblical worldview, and them understanding the importance of purity and not giving stuff away is way better than just choosing an age or just saying like, you know, we won't even talk about it until this point in your life, to just train them as you go. Let's be more in all of these cases, whether it's about, disrespect or the irresponsibility you're dating. Let's be parents that lead with biblical wisdom, that we are praying for our kids and praying over the wisdom that we need to raise them well. And let's set an example for them, and let's set a trajectory for them and a vision for their life that's Christ-centered, that's not muddled by the things of the world, and that we talk openly with our kids and prep them and teach them and train them as they go, so that when they hit those key ages, whether it's 16 to date or 18 to leave the house, they're ready. They've wrestled with these things. They've understood. They've trusted your heart in the way you've been leading them. And then they're more likely to adopt those values moving forward. So I hope that these topics are helpful to you. I pray for all you parents out there raising teenagers. Keep up the good work. Get on your knees and pray, and use these topics as a way to help you prep and train and prepare as you move along in the journey.
Thanks for listening. If you would like to give to help support our ministry, please visit PursueGOD.org/donate. Find more resources to talk about these topics with your small group, family, or mentor on PursueGOD.org.